So the first thing I would say is whether or not this is a reparative effort is up for debate. I am not sure if it's a reparative effort because I
Mhm.
don't know what his motive was. So what I would do in this case, if this was Frank sitting in my office, like make believe, I would say let's go back because I would want to get a lot closer to that thing, such as his pacing back and forth and the self-talk, like the piece of shit that he is, and the escalating rage. I would have to get into the rage because clearly there was a ton of rage there, as I know because he said tear into this person, which suggests that he was ready to really go after her, right?
Mhm.
But what happened is we don't, in my opinion, we don't know the answer whether this was truly a reparative act because Dr. R didn't ask any exploratory questions. He already knew, based on a theory, what Frank was experiencing, what he needed. In other words, you and I, Renee, spoke in our prior discussions about guilt and shame, about different theories. Where does it come from? What does it look like? Why is it here? Of course, we did give some examples along the way, but it was mostly theory. And that's what Dr. R does. So I would say, let's go back and look at when you were pacing back and forth, what was going through your mind? What were you thinking? You see, that's the kind of stuff that I want to hear. Not just that I want to hear it, but I want Frank to get more closely attuned to all of what was going on inside of him. So from this perspective, we don't know what fueled Frank's rage. What actually made him want to tear into this woman? Or like, let me just say again, this is a theory and I wouldn't suggest this to Frank, but maybe when he was left waiting, there was something unconsciously that got stirred up in him, which is not uncommon, by the way, for people who have narcissistic vulnerabilities. So he could have said something like, "You're keeping me waiting, and that
Mhm.
hurts," or "You forgot about me," or "You don't see me," or "I don't matter,"
I
or
don't matter.
"Nobody cares about me." Like, again, these are just a few of the things, that could have that would have been in his head. And maybe not so unconscious, by the way, but again, we don't know because no time was taken to explore this. And it was one other thing. So let's say with people again with these narcissistic preoccupations, when someone makes them feel bad or helpless or vulnerable, and we know Frank was in that position because he was left waiting, but he also had a need. And for people who have, personality traits, having a need could be very difficult. So he could not tolerate that feeling. So the reaction then becomes to eliminate the other person. In other words, you have done this to me, and now I'm going to counterattack. And that's the whole part about him ripping into her. Why? Because in his mind at that moment, she caused this feeling to happen, which of course she didn't already. That was in there prior
Mhm.
to, but she brought it out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's actually a great way to kind of think this through. I love what I hear you saying is uh, to help Frank to approach himself with curiosity.
Yes.
That get curious about the thoughts that were going through his head and where they were coming from or why they were there, or at least identifying them, being able to stay present enough to identify your own thoughts and your own reactions. So I do love that. That is something I do talk about a lot is
Yeah.
if we approach our own internal self-talk with more judgment, all we're going to do is make more negative self-talk.
Yep.
Like we're just going
Yep.
to feed that spiral.
Yep.
But if we can approach our own self-talk with curiosity, then that stops that loop and kind of lets us now maybe find a place of some safety where we can actually look at what's going on.
Yeah. And I'll add one more thing to that if you don't mind, which is if we have that self talk and we bring it to somebody else, like, "Oh, I really screwed up. I'm such a loser. Look what I did," or "Look at how aggressive," even that is not reparative. And we see that with Frank very
Mhm.
clearly by his question. Like, is that really supposed to help somebody? Because if you could get reassurance, like, "Oh, no, you would just Some level of validation is important. I just want to mention that. Validating is always the first step when someone's in a dysregulated state, but we don't stop there. Again, in the psychodynamic field, that's the first step. So what Renee, you and I are doing, we're looking at what would go beyond just validating and then giving a theory, but trying really, like, to what your point, just what you were just saying, is help him begin to verbalize and name and get comfortable with all the different feelings that were going on inside of him, which clearly he's not comfortable, or else he wouldn't have had to put them on to the delivery woman or just turn to rage and
Right.
attack. Yeah.
Right. When you have a person that is in, this narcissistic tendency, that back to what you were talking about, is whenever they do feel vulnerable or needy or
Hmm.
helpless, any of those feelings that are, what you're going to categorize over here as being needy or being vulnerable, they can't handle them. They
Yeah.
can't, these just trigger that frustration and rage. And so then, I've talked about before, they come out in an explosion with anger and rage, or they come out with an implosion of victim and shame, like I'm such a bad person. and
Yep.
and neither one of those paths is reparative, okay,
Yep.
to
Yep.
speak to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because in the situation where somebody, is feeling that shame and says, "I can't believe I'm just such a bad person," and they walk away or stay there, either way, that's not an apology. It's not a way to fix anything, because what it does is kicks you into fix it mode for them. Like what you're
Yeah.
saying, we're validating and over validating. Now we're trying to pump them back up.
Yeah. It's like they could, so that's why the jury's still out with Frank in terms of offering her a drink or excusing the broken eggs, is because we don't really know if that was a genuinely caring, reparative moment, or if he was restoring his own self-image. You see, in other words, after a moment of being full of rage and really aggression and wanting to attack her, then he can make himself feel better by saying, "But look at what a nice guy I am. I
Mhm.
offered her a drink." So, by the way, as an aside, that's something I would get much closer to as well, which is I would ask again inquisitive questions like, "Let's go back. When you were thinking about offering her a drink, what did you imagine? What did you picture? How did you think she was going to respond? How is she going to look at you?" You see, now we're getting to that thing about gaze, which you and I spoke about in that earlier conversation. Because with shame, gaze is so important. The way you imagine people are looking down at you or judging you.